Louise Kay, 1988, Eastbourne. How did a girl and her car vanish? Every disappearance leaves behind a silence that feels different from ordinary absence. A person can miss a phone call, stay out late, change plans, or take a road no one expected. But there comes a moment when waiting turns into fear, and fear turns into the realization that something has gone terribly wrong. In the summer of 1988, a young woman from East Sussex went out for what should have been a normal night with friends. There was music, conversation, a late drive through familiar streets, and a short journey home that should have taken only minutes. By morning, she was gone. Not only had Louise Kay disappeared, but the car she was driving had vanished with her. There was no confirmed crime scene. There was no body. There was no final phone call, no verified sighting that explained where she went, and no recovered vehicle sitting in a field, a garage, or a scrapyard. Louise was 18 years old when she disappeared, and for decades her case has remained one of Eastbourne's most haunting mysteries. Eastbourne is a seaside town on the south coast of England in East Sussex. To visitors, it can look calm and picturesque with its pier, coastal roads, and open views across the English Channel. But a short distance away lies Beachy Head, a dramatic headland known for its high white chalk cliffs and exposed landscape. In daylight, it can look beautiful. In the early hours of the morning, it can feel remote, empty, and unforgiving. Louise lived near Eastbourne in the Polegate area with her family. She was at the beginning of adult life, still young enough to be surrounded by friends and plans, but old enough to move through the world with a growing sense of independence. Those closest to her expected her to come home. There was nothing in the known timeline that suggested she was planning to disappear. On Thursday, June 23, 1988, Louise went out in Eastbourne. According to later accounts, she was with friends and her boyfriend, Pete, at a disco on Eastbourne Pier. It was the kind of night that would have seemed unremarkable at the time, a group of young people out together, making their way through the late hours of a seaside town. Louise was driving that night. The car belonged to her father, and it was difficult to mistake for any other vehicle. It was a gold Ford Fiesta with a noticeably white driver's side door. In some case summaries, the registration is given as RFG 740R. That odd detail, the mismatched door, would later become one of the most important pieces of the case. After the group left the disco in the early hours of Friday morning, Louise began giving people lifts home. During that journey, some later accounts say she and Pete argued about a planned trip to Newquay, where they had hoped to find summer work. Those details come from secondary reports, so they should be treated with care. What matters is that by the time Louise was last known to be driving, the ordinary night out had already shifted into something more tense and uncertain. Pete got out of the car, according to those later accounts, and Louise continued on with a friend, often identified as Sarah. Around 4 o'clock in the morning on Friday, June 24, 1988, Louise reportedly dropped Sarah off at her home. Sarah is said to have asked whether Louise wanted to come inside, but Louise declined. What Louise said next has never been fully settled. In one version, she said she was going home. In another, she said she was going to Beachy Head. That difference may sound small, but in a missing persons case, a single sentence can change the entire direction of an investigation. If Louise intended to go home, then something may have happened on a familiar local route. If she intended to go to Beachy Head, then she may have driven alone toward a more isolated coastal area in the dark. Either way, after she left Sarah's home, the confirmed trail ended. Louise did not arrive home. Her family did not hear from her. The gold Ford Fiesta did not return. At first, there may have been room for ordinary explanations. Perhaps she had stayed somewhere else. Perhaps she needed time alone after a difficult night. Perhaps she had stopped the car and planned to come back later. But as the hours passed, those possibilities became harder to believe. The concern grew sharper because the car was missing too. A person can vanish in ways that are difficult to trace, but a distinctive vehicle is different. It can be seen on roads, left in a parking area, recorded in sales, found after a crash, or taken apart by someone in the motor trade. Louise's Ford Fiesta had a feature people might remember. A gold car with a white driver's door should not have disappeared easily. Police searched for answers. The case would later be associated with the name Operation Azure. Investigators reconstructed Louise's last known movements and looked into the car. Appeals were made to scrap dealers because if the vehicle had been destroyed or dismantled, someone might have remembered it. But no confirmed trace of the Fiesta emerged. That fact makes the case especially disturbing. If Louise had driven to Beachy Head and suffered an accident, what happened to the car? If she had chosen to leave voluntarily, why did neither she nor the vehicle ever surface again? And if someone else became involved after she drove away, how did that person remove both Louise and such a recognizable car from the known record? For the Kay family, the mystery was not an abstract puzzle. It was personal, immediate, and devastating. Louise was a daughter and a sister whose life stopped in the public record at 18. Her sister, Nicola Stork, later spoke about the family's search for answers and her fears about one man whose name would become linked to the case in public discussion. That name was Peter Tobin. Tobin was a convicted serial killer responsible for the murders of Angelica Kluke, Vicky Hamilton, and Dinah McNichol. His known crimes revealed a man capable of killing young women and concealing bodies. The remains of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol were found at a former home connected to him in Margate, and his history led police to examine whether he may have had other victims. After Tobin's convictions, police across the United Kingdom looked into his movements through Operation Anagram, a wider review of possible links to unsolved murders and disappearances. Louise Kay's disappearance became one of the cases discussed publicly in connection with him. There were reasons why the theory attracted attention. Tobin had links to Brighton and the South Coast. Reports state that around the time Louise disappeared, he was connected to Eastbourne through work and Brighton through residence. Former detective and television investigator Mark Williams Thomas later argued that Tobin was responsible for Louise's disappearance. One claim became especially striking. Williams Thomas reported that Tobin had connections to second-hand cars and that around the period of Louise's disappearance, he was said to have been trying to sell a vehicle with a hand-painted door. For anyone familiar with Louise's missing Fiesta, the detail seemed alarming. But it remains an allegation within a theory, not a proven fact established in court. That distinction matters. Peter Tobin was never charged in connection with Louise's disappearance. He was never convicted in relation to her case. When questioned, he reportedly denied knowing her. Sussex police later stated that there was no evidence implicating Tobin or any other named person in Louise's disappearance. Still, public interest continued because the circumstances felt difficult to dismiss. Louise vanished from the Eastbourne area. Beachy Head was mentioned in accounts of her last possible destination. A separate Eastbourne case, the death of Jessie Earle, also had a connection to Beachy Head. Jessie disappeared in 1980, and her remains were found there in 1989. Her case was later formally recognized as an unlawful killing by murder. The mention of both cases together has often created a darker atmosphere around the Louise Kay mystery, but care is needed here too. Similar geography does not prove the same offender. A public theory, no matter how compelling, cannot replace evidence. In 2010, police searched properties in Brighton and Portslade connected to Tobin. Specialist teams and forensic archaeologists examined areas including gardens and interior spaces. The searches were thorough, but they did not produce evidence linking those locations to crimes by Tobin in relation to Louise Kay. In 2018, renewed attention followed the ITV documentary series The Investigator, a British crime story. The program explored the possibility of Tobin's involvement and prompted further public discussion. Reports described new information from members of the public, including claims about suspicious behavior and possible locations of interest. Louise's family were kept informed, and there were calls for further searches. But renewed attention did not bring a confirmed resolution. No remains were found. The car was not recovered. No prosecution followed. The case remained open, painful, and unresolved. This is what makes Louise Kay's disappearance so difficult to tell. There are facts that can be stated clearly, and then there are spaces where only questions remain. She was 18. She went out in Eastbourne on the night of June 23, 1988. In the early hours of June 24th, she dropped off a friend. She was driving her father's gold Ford Fiesta with the white driver's side door. After that, both Louise and the car disappeared. Everything beyond that must be handled with caution. Maybe she drove toward home. Maybe she drove toward Beachy Head. Maybe she met someone she trusted. Maybe she encountered a stranger. Maybe the car was hidden, repainted, destroyed, or moved far from the area. The absence of the vehicle is not proof of any one theory, but it remains one of the strongest signs that something more complex may have happened. Peter Tobin died in prison in 2022. If he had any knowledge of Louise Kay's fate, he did not leave behind a public confession that solved the case. For Louise's family, that means the central questions remain unanswered. The passage of time can make old cases feel distant, but for families, time does not close the door. It only changes the shape of the grief. Every anniversary brings back the same missing pieces. The last drive, the unanswered route, the car that never appeared, the young woman who never came home. Louise Kay's case is not haunting because of one dramatic discovery. It is haunting because of what was never found. There was no final scene to study, no recovered vehicle to examine, no confirmed place where her journey ended. Instead, there is a gap in the early morning hours of June 24, 1988, and that gap has lasted for decades. Somewhere between a friend's house, the road home, and the possibility of Beachy Head, Louise Kay disappeared from the known world. Her family was left with uncertainty. Investigators were left with fragments. The public was left with theories. And until someone comes forward or new evidence finally reveals what happened, the mystery remains exactly where it began. With an 18-year-old woman, a gold Ford Fiesta with one white door, and a short drive through Eastbourne that should never have become her last known journey.